Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the DeepCool CH560 Digital. Here I'm reviewing the case and showing you a number of different things that you can do with it. I've built in this case in various different ways, with a 360mm all-in-one cooler on the front, top, and an air tower cooler, so I'm going to show you the various different things that you can do with it, and the things to bear in mind if you're thinking about buying it. The highlights and lowlights of the case design, and the curiosities of it, and some of the niceties. You can see that it has this very nice design that has lots of airflow potential in it, and you can also buy additional fans that you can then mount on the bottom. So you can put two 120mm fans on the bottom here, just above the PSU. Now I do think the value of those is a bit questionable, and I'll do some tests later on to show you the results of the difference between them, but it is an interesting build because you can vertically mount your graphics card, and as you can see there's a lot of holes here as well, so you've got some potentially good airflow, and you've got some nice RGB lighting, as well as plenty of options in terms of where you're mounting and installing things. Now it comes with three 140mm RGB fans on the front and one 120mm RGB fan on the rear, as well as this display that's able to show you both temperatures of your GPU and CPU, as well as usage percentages. The case is intelligently pre-wired in a way that will allow you to plug in a couple of cables and then change the RGB lighting with a button on top of the case. This means that you can switch between various different lighting profiles with relative ease. There's just a button up here and you just press that and change between those various different schemes. They're pretty standard and straightforward to use, and it's nice enough in its aesthetic. At the rear of the case you'll find there are some channelings for the various different cables, and obviously a lot of cables to deal with. Now the fan wiring is actually pre-wired for you. The RGB lighting and fan power is daisy chained together, connected up, and then you basically just have to plug in a couple of cables. And I've done a build guide separately on this where I talked about that in depth. But the controller at the top controls that RGB lighting, and essentially this allows you to then just press that button on top, as I showed you, and change between the lighting effects. This needs to be connected up to SATA power from your power supply unit in order to power it, but otherwise it's fairly straightforward because it's all wired together. However, if you want to, you can detach the white cables from that black one that runs to the controller, and alternatively then use the additional cable that's included in the box, which takes this connection and adds in a 5V RGB header, which you can then run to your motherboard, and then you can control the RGB lighting on the fans with your motherboard's RGB software, for example MSI's Mystic Light, and that'll allow you to control the lighting separately that way instead. That then means that you no longer need SATA power for that controller because it's not used. You're bypassing it and instead using your motherboard software. The fans are wired in with the RGB connection and with the fan power, so all four fans are actually daisy chained together into a single connection, which you can connect to a system fan header. Now I don't think that you should actually connect four fans to one fan header. I don't know if that's advisable. It does work, but I don't think it's optimum, so that's something to bear in mind. The case itself, the door is held on with just a magnet, and it's easy to tug off, but not so bad that it's going to fall off. However, there is a securing screw which you can also use to hold that in place. The front panel pulls away, as you can see, and then you can access those fans if you want to. And there's some thin mesh on there, as well as some venting on the front. So it's pretty good for that, and you can obviously give that a clean when you need to. On top it has a dust filter which is held on with magnets, pretty straightforward, so you can take that off pretty easily and give that a clean as well when you need to. And then on the underside at the bottom below the power supply unit is also another small one, which I found came off really easily, so that's something to bear in mind. But you can see we can face the power supply downwards, and then it'll get some good air from the bottom, and there's good airflow because it's got some pretty decent feet that keep it reasonably high off the desk as well, so it should get some good airflow going through there too. On top of the case there is just one USB-A connector and one USB Type-C. You have the power button and the LED buttons, so the wiring of the front panel connectors is pretty straightforward because you only have the hard disk drive LED and power switch to wire in, and then obviously the HD audio and USB-A and USB-Cs. But for the front panel connectors, you've just got two cables, which makes it really straightforward. That does mean that you don't have a reset switch on this case though, so if you need to reset your computer, you'll have to do it through Windows. Now in terms of mounting the all-in-one cooler, I said you can put a 360mm cooler on top. I'm using the Galahad 2 from Lian Li here as an example. You can see me struggling with it, so it's pretty difficult to get in. And that's mostly because of that 120mm fan at the rear. what I found was the best way to deal with this was just to simply remove that fan. Now this is going to vary depending on your cooler, I think, because if you've got one that doesn't have quite as big tubes coming out of it, you can see this one's got some adjustable tubes, for example, sticking out the rear. It might be a little bit easier to negotiate in there, but I found this was pretty tough, and getting that 120mm fan out of the way is one way of dealing with it. Unfortunately, that fan then won't go back in again, so that's something to keep in mind. But you could potentially do this as a pretty basic setup, so you've got 3 140mm fans intaking on the front, and then 3 fans exhausting through the 360mm radiator out of the top. That would be some pretty basic airflow for a decent mid-range build, and it would work quite well. But you can see you can't replace that 120mm fan at the rear, which is a real shame. Perhaps if you put the tubes at the front of the case instead for the AIO, that might work. The other thing that I thought was interesting about this case is that you can remove those 140mm fans from the front, but they're held on by a tray. So there's actually a fan tray that's holding them to the front of the case rather than the fans being mounted directly to the case itself, which is pretty interesting. This also means that you can use the 360mm radiator on the front of the case instead. Now don't do it like this if you're planning on doing that, because the fans are now facing the wrong way, but you could potentially have a push-pull setup with the case fans on the front and then some other fans on the other side, on the inner side of the case, both facing the same direction, so you've got some good airflow, and that gives you options. Alternatively, obviously, you could replace the front fans with your own, so you could have matching fans on the radiator, or you could just put fans on the outside of the radiator and mount it that way. But you can see it's a pretty interesting design. I'm not usually seeing something like this. We've got a tray on the front as well as the fan tray on the inside of the case as well, so it's pretty curious. One of the things you will have noticed is we've got tubes at the top of the rad here. I found that it wasn't possible to put them at the bottom, so if that's something you want to do, you can't really do it with this one. But again, that's because the way the tubes stick out of the radiator. You might be able to with a different one, but you couldn't here. But you can see there is still quite a bit of space, even with this 3090 graphics card in there as well. And talking of graphics cards, one of the other bonuses of this case is the little anti-sag bracket, which is included as standard. So there's a little arching anti-sag bracket on the right-hand side here, which you can then use to adjust and support your GPU. In theory, this is pretty good because it means that if you've got a heavy graphics card, over time it's not going to cause any issues, and this isn't an additional purchase, it's included as standard. But what I found was when I first installed my GPU was it wouldn't touch the graphics card. Now the reason for this is you need to adjust it at the rear. There are a couple of screws here below all the cables, which you can then loosen, then you can slide the mount up and down, and then you can adjust it and tighten it up, obviously, and this will then get into the right place. However, when I was wired in, I found that I couldn't push it all the way up, and you can see that you still can't get it to reach the graphics card here, and the reason for that is it's actually blocked by the SATA connections from my hard disk drives, so not ideal. You have to remove those in order to be able to adjust it. It's worth noting that you can actually put this bracket on the right-hand side. You can see there's another place where you could potentially mount this bracket further on. So if you've got a really long GPU, you could put it there as an alternative. But unfortunately, it means that you're blocking some of the ports if you're using it in its standard position. However, moving that data cable down to a bottom one, I can then put the GPU in, and then the anti-sag bracket is there to support it. Now, I do really like that that is there as an addition to it, and it is nice to have because that's an additional bonus to the case design as well. The other thing that's nice is the simplicity of other installation things. So for example, installing the SSDs, you have these standoff screws which you screw into the holes on your SSDs on these crucial drives, for example, and then you can just pop them into the rubber washers on the back of the case, and then they're held in place there. Now you can install 2 drives here and a third one potentially down in the hard disk drive cage, which I'll show you in a second, and that makes it really straightforward for installing these and wiring them in a nice way. Now the cage alternatively can take 2 hard disk drives, one in the middle and one on top. It's removable, it's held down with a couple of screws on the bottom of it, and you can see that you can also adjust the position of it, which is important, and I'll show you why in a second. But you can take these out with those couple of screws and then just remove it from the notches, install your hard disk drive in there, and then pop it back in and secure it. The installation for that's pretty simple as well. It's just 6 screws screwed into this drive, and then it's just notched back in and pointed in the right direction so that the cables can be plugged in easily. But you can move it further towards the front, which means that you'll get the fan blowing closer onto it, and also you've got more space for your power supply unit. So if you've got a bigger one with longer cables, then that won't be an issue. Talking of cables, there's some cable management hooks around the case. Now, I don't go over the top with cable management in order to be able to test the cases and see how easy it is to close the door after you've done it. So my cable management is pretty messy, but this is intentional. But you can use some ties, and you will see there are Velcro hooks in here as well for looping the things through and tying them down. And there are some other points where you can Velcro tie and plastic tie if you want to, so you can actually neaten things up. What I did like is these rubber grommets on here, so you've got some rubber areas where the cables will come through, and it's pretty well concealed and looks reasonably neat. Now, I mentioned already that you can throw in those extra fans, so these are an additional purchase. You have to buy your own fans, then you can put 120mm fans on the bottom, just connecting them up to the system fan headers. Now, I will note that it does get quite a bit louder if you do this, although it's obviously going to vary depending on what fans you're using. As you've seen already, the power supply is right below one of these fans, so whether it's actually going to do any good pulling air through that area is questionable, and I'll show you the data for that in a second. But obviously it is an option. You wouldn't be able to do this if you're vertically mounting your graphics card, but you can do it if not. And when the door is on, you can see they're mostly hidden from view as well. If you're looking top down, it'd be different, but side on view, you can see that you can't really see those fans that I've mounted in the bottom there. But unfortunately, the other thing you can't see is the digital display, which you'll notice isn't working. Now, the reason for that isn't actually a problem necessarily, but it was a problem that I had, is that one of the cables from the USB connection that runs from that screen to your motherboard was loose and had come out. And I'll be honest, I spent ages trying to sort it out and reposition that cable into the USB connector, but I couldn't get it in there. I am clumsy and useless perhaps, but I'm pretty sure this is a very niche issue and that most people won't experience this problem. But for me, that connector was broken and I couldn't fix it. And so I can't show you what the display is like, unfortunately, but you're unlikely to see the same problem if you get the case as well. So just wanted to point that out as a potential problem. I think it still looks great even without the display, but obviously if you bought it for the display and then it doesn't work, this might be why, or maybe you forgot to connect that USB connection. Now, the other thing that you can do with it is you can get a vertically mounted GPU. I'm using Lee & Lee's PCIe Gen 4 vertical mounting bracket for this, which is obviously an additional purchase, and it will seat in there. It is one of several options out there, obviously, but basically the cable plugs into there. You've got the graphics card plugged into the bracket. The bracket then mounts onto the standard PCIe brackets at the back of the case, and that secures in place, and it sits quite a far away from the glass, and so you've got good airflow from the front fans and still the fans on the graphics card as well. And obviously the other benefit of this is the cable channeling at the rear enables you to run the cables from there pretty easily, so you can still reach your GPU and keep things nice and neat there as well, as you see. So the experience of that is pretty good too, and there's some nice area there for that. I think this looks pretty good actually as a final sort of setup of what you could do with it potentially, although this is a personal preference. But you can see just how much space there is there, so it shouldn't be a problem with cooling the graphics card down. The other thing that you will have spied from a few of these shots, though, is that when you put the door back on, some of it is blocked, but that's going to vary depending on what your GPU looks like, the sort of size and shape of it and other things. Now, I did some tests. I wanted to test and see how we got on with this. So I started out with the graphics card in that vertical position, and I ran some stress tests and benchmarks on it. The results, I could just show you what that was like and the performance of it. And as you can see, the temps are pretty good. We're looking at a max 66 degrees on the GPU, 90 degrees on the memory, and 79 degrees on the hotspot. But the test results of this showed that it ran pretty well on a variety of different tests with 3D Mark. So I ran a lot of different stress tests in there. I then also ran Intel's Extreme Tuning utility with stress testing the CPU, because as you can see, I'm using an air tower cooler for this, so I want to see how that got on. Now, it did thermal throttle, but it is an i9, so it is worth noting that, and it still did pretty well in the temperatures. Then I swapped it around, and as I've shown you, I put it in the standard setup, but with those two extra fans on the bottom. What I discovered is actually a negligible difference from those extra fans. There was a couple of degrees difference on the GPU, and weirdly, the CPU actually ran a bit hotter with the fans in the bottom position below the graphics card, so I'd actually suggest that it's probably not worth using those, really. It didn't make much difference, didn't seem to be beneficial in doing that, but obviously it's going to vary depending on what fans you're putting into the case, what cooler you're using, and more. Overall, a really nice case, and it runs surprisingly quietly, especially with that Noctua cooler. If you found this useful, check out the links in the description, and thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.